Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm very excited about what I hope will be a robust dialogue about fair housing, the implications as we pause to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. I'm really excited that we have a panel of individuals who in some way specialize in housing and fair housing and housing laws that will all help to shape not only our Montclair community, but the nation. Two years before the death of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., in 1968, Martin Luther King had become certain that fair housing, a policy that barred housing discrimination and could integrate neighborhoods, was critical. He believed racial segregation in housing made it possible for northern and southern city officials to provide different levels of services on every imaginable level. Our schools, our educations, hospitals, housing inspection, code enforcement, public parks, and even swimming pools. It wasn't until a week after Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination in Memphis that then President Lyndon Johnson passed what has come to know as the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act is an act that is put into place that is supposed to make sure that we don't discriminate against people based on race, creed, color, national origin, ancestry, nationality, marital or domestic partnerships, or civil union status, familial status, sex, pregnancy, gender identity or expression, affectional or sexual orientation, abilities, source of lawful income or source of lawful rent payments, including Section 8. This evening, we're going to take a look back and then we're going to move forward and try to make some determinations at a time when many people in the nation are fearful, as our now Secretary of Housing and Urban Development recently said that he wishes to draw back on a law that Congress passed that was put into place in 2015 that was to affirm fair housing. Many people are concerned that this may be the end of fair housing, that we may stop moving towards having communities that are integrated. And so when you look going backwards, it's easy for a lot of people to say, okay, yeah, I know we can't discriminate based on the list of things that I mentioned, and they feel really good about that. Oh yeah, no, we don't do that. But it's much more than that, and we don't often have those conversations, which I'm hoping to have tonight, that really talk about integrating communities, because one of the main purposes of having the Fair Housing Act and its amendments is not only to make sure you don't discriminate based on those things, but also to integrate communities, to try to abolish segregated communities where you have a heavy concentration of low-income individuals in one end and a heavy concentration of high-income individuals in another area. And that's the part that we don't talk about as much as we do about, yeah, no, I wouldn't discriminate against people based on race. So this evening, I'm going to introduce to you they're going to introduce themselves, this panel, and then we're going to have a presentation by Miss Amanda Smith, who is joining us from New Jersey Citizen Action Education Fund. She's going to do a PowerPoint presentation that's available for you. And then we want to hear from you. The conversation is not restricted to just Montclair, although many of us are from Montclair, and it would be good to hear that. But whatever comes to you, we're going to leave it open, and for as much as Ms. Smith will share, if she wishes to take questions or whatever during her PowerPoint, it's fine. So let's don't hold back. One of the reasons I really enjoy these things are because when people raise questions and concerns, it really helps us to focus and think about things that perhaps we hadn't already thought about. So I'm going to start here with Mr. Burr.
Hi.
How are you?
I want to thank Ms. Councilwoman Baskerville for inviting me this evening. I'm very honored to be here. My name is Paul Burr. I'm a local attorney at Burr Legal Services here in town in Montclair. I'm also a realtor and a developer, local developer. And I'm here to add insight to the panel and to the discussion, and I think this is going to be a very interesting evening. Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us. And next, I'm sure he doesn't need much introduction, Mr. William Scott. He is our Township Chair of the Housing Commission, and he's also the chair of the Montclair NAACP Housing Commission. He's most recently been trying to get a sense of if the residents in Montclair are concerned about trying to put in some rent controls or measures to try to see what we can do to keep rents affordable for people that are in the area now, and try in some way to make sure we're doing all that we can do to prevent the exodus of individuals that may desire to still remain in Montclair. So, Mr. Scott, thank you for being here.
Okay. Well, basically, all I have to do is say ditto, okay, because she gives me such a warm introduction all the time. But I just want to be able to add a little bit to the conversation tonight. If there's any questions in regards to affordable housing, because I am the co-chair of the Montclair Housing Commission, and I'm also accompanied tonight with Megan York, who is also the new co-chair of the Montclair Housing Commission. Okay, we had Harold Simon for a number of years, but he did step down. But Megan, she is a planner by trade, so we have continued expertise in the Housing Commission for the Township of Montclair. And as Councilwoman Baskerville mentioned, I'm the chair of the NAACP Housing Committee. But, we want to also be aware of any housing discrimination, even though we're looking for additional housing units within the township. Discrimination is one of our major concerns from an NAACP standpoint. And I also have some of my committee members here today. Kathy Hawley is a committee member for the NAACP Housing Committee. Councilwoman Baskerville has many hats. She is also a member of my NAACP Housing Committee as well. So I brought some handouts in regards to some of the things we're doing from an NAACP standpoint, which are on the table, so feel free to pick them up and take a look at them. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being with us. And next we have with us Ms. Deirdre Malloy. She wears many hats in the township as well. Ms. Malloy is, are you still with Home Corps? Is that transitioned? She's in transition. She's a realtor in town, and she has a lot of knowledge in that regard. She was with Home Corps in Montclair before, and I understand that she is transitioning to another area that will also allow her to use her expertise and her desire to make sure that housing is fair and equitable, not only here in Montclair, but throughout the state of New Jersey and beyond. Ms. Malloy, thank you for being with us.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I guess I, too, can say ditto. I am a fourth-generation Montclair resident, and as Councilwoman Baskerville said, I am a realtor. I've been a realtor for almost 20 years. I'm also on the Montclair Housing Commission, and I also do some consulting with the federal government, state and federal level. As a real estate professional, I've been doing property management since 2009 in town for multiple owners, as well as working with Home Corps. I also work with developers, and as a housing commission, I just want you to know that people who are looking to do development in Montclair, come and have a conversation with us, as well as the planning board and several other boards and committees within the township. I also sometimes act as an advisor to certain people who are looking to do housing here, as well as landlords. So I too I just want to thank, and if we could give Councilwoman a round of applause, please, because I think this conversation is really necessary in 2018. I'm looking forward to having an open dialogue, whether you're a resident, a tenant, a landlord, a owner, a developer. If you have questions, ask. We have enough people here on the panel who would be able to answer them accurately, and if we don't have the answers, we'll get them for you. So please, it's an information session, it's a dialogue, and this is a great opportunity to have your questions answered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here with us. One of the members of our panel, Mr. Bruce Morgan, who is the head of our Section 8 housing here in Montclair, is a little bit delayed. They're doing a education seminar for I guess the people that are involved with HUD housing, Section 8 housing here in Montclair, and he expects that he's going to be joining us around 7:30 this evening. And so he's also going to bring a wealth of information and maybe even be able to answer some of the questions from different perspective. So at this point in time, Ms. Smith, again, who is with us from New Jersey Citizen Action, is going to share a little bit about herself. I had the privilege and honor of being on a radio show with Ms. Smith about 2 weeks ago, and so I'm very excited about her coming here, agreeing to join us this evening and share some of the information with us that I was fortunate enough to hear during the radio show. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much for being here. This is going to be a great conversation, and my goal with this presentation is just to lay some groundwork and background knowledge on the Fair Housing Act, fair housing in New Jersey, and what people who have been discriminated against, what their rights are, and what they can do about it. So, as Renee said, my name is Amanda Smith. I'm the Fair Housing Test Coordinator at New Jersey Citizen Action. Before I started with Citizen Action, I worked in real estate in Florida for 12 years. So we moved to New Jersey. I joined Citizen Action in April of last year when we became HUD designated to do fair housing testing throughout the state. So this is a federal project that we do, and we actually just got recertified. Woo! To continue testing. So our program is twofold. We have enforcement and education. So enforcement includes counseling victims of discrimination, doing testing investigations, which we'll go into further, and then education is what I'm doing here with you now, along with compliance training for housing providers, realtors. You know, we work hand in hand. We want to make sure that everyone is aware of their responsibilities and their rights under the Fair Housing Act. Our goal is just to build stronger, more integrated communities. So throughout this presentation, I'll touch on some best practices for housing providers as we go through different types of discrimination, in case there are. As we know, there are housing providers here with us tonight. So we work diligently to ensure people have access to housing, and that access to housing is not hindered by discrimination. Also, I want to note we have copies of this PowerPoint presentation on the table over there if you'd like a copy. So like Councilwoman Baskerville said, the Fair Housing Act is celebrating its 50th year this year. And under the Federal Fair Housing Act, it's unlawful to discriminate against individuals based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. Discrimination can take many forms: a refusal to rent housing, denying that there's housing available, setting different terms and conditions on rental or sales of housing, advertising in a discriminatory way, and also threatening, coercing, harassing, intimidating people. Also, sexual harassment is included in here, tenants who face that, including quid pro quo, and just general harassment. So under the Fair Housing Act, it's not just realtors and landlords who have to abide by it, it's basically everyone. And then last week there was a big study that came out that found that a lot of lenders are discriminating when loaning money to potential home buyers. So that's another thing to think about as well. Penalties for violating the Fair Housing Act are various and wide, but they include lawsuits, punitive damages, government monitoring, injunctions, on and on. This is just basically to remind us that Fair Housing Act isn't optional, it's the law, and we'll go through these penalties more a little bit later. There are some exemptions. They're limited to owner-occupied properties. Here in New Jersey, it's an owner-occupied property, 2 units or less, that the owner occupies one of those. So if you have a duplex and the owner lives on one half of the duplex and wants to rent out the other, that is an exemption unless they bring a realtor or broker in to rent out the property for them. There's certain for sale by owners, of an owner that owns less than 3 single-family properties. Certain housing by religious organizations can give priorities to members, and then also housing for older persons that's certified by HUD. It's important to note that advertising is never exempt. If you do see a discriminatory ad, that is illegal. And contact me, contact the people on this panel if you do see that. Some examples include advertising that says for mature adults only, not ideal for families with kids, prefer single female, great for a retired couple. We always need to focus on advertisements should describe the property and not the occupants. Next, I'm going to cover some common ways protected classes experience housing discrimination. Steering is one of the most common forms of discrimination. We're probably all really familiar with steering, but it's directing a resident for whatever reason to a specific property, to a specific part of the neighborhood or community. An example of this is only allowing families with children to live on the first floor apartment. A housing provider can push a customer towards purchasing a certain home because it's located in a certain part of the neighborhood. Or they can fail to show a buyer a property that would fit their criteria. We actually got a case of steering this week, which is not uncommon, like I mentioned. The steering happened on a sales test, and because a person didn't fit a certain religious background, they were steered away from a part of the area. So again, just best practices for our housing providers in here. Showing all available properties to match a client's criteria, letting the clients decide what to see and what to skip, giving facts only about the neighborhood and the property, and again, not describing the residents or the neighbors, keeping it focused on the property. Fair housing violators have been known to establish different terms, rules, or conditions based on the protected class. For example, we had a housing provider that had a pattern of telling families with children that the security deposit is 2 months' rent. They told families that didn't have children that the security deposit is based on their credit score. So that's different terms and conditions. Rules and regulations and policies should be written out. They should apply to all residents equally, and they should use terms like guests or residents. Use lots of documentation. In the next few slides, we'll dive deeper into some protected classes and ways of discrimination. Also, during my presentation, if you have any questions, raise your hand. I'm happy we can have a conversation during this, so it's fine. Race discrimination. There are subtle differences in treatment based on race or national origin that often go undetected by consumers. So a way that we get around this as a fair housing organization is through testing. Testing can document when a white prospective home seeker is treated more favorably than minority home seekers. Again, treatment can be steering, different terms and conditions, or the level of service given to home seekers. Is the minority getting a call back, being told about specials? Maybe the white tester is and they're not. So with testing, we can take a bird's eye view and see what both testers are experiencing. So it's important to note, not a lot of people realize this, but immigration status does not affect fair housing rights. HUD does not ask for your immigration status. Your name's not even required on the HUD complaint form. So no matter the home seeker status, housing discrimination is still illegal. Housing providers can ask for immigration documentation, but they need to ask that documentation from everyone who's seeking homes from them, not just based on someone's national origin. So New Jersey Citizen Action, we get more fair housing complaints from people with disabilities than any other protected class. Under the Fair Housing Act, the definition of disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. Also important to note, it includes people who have a history of impairment or people who may be perceived as having a disability. We've seen cases where a person with a disability is harassed. They're asked about the nature and the extent of their disability, and even had their disability disclosed to another resident. All of this is illegal. It's discrimination. Yes?
Also, if an individual has a mental issue and they need a support process or mechanism, they have the right to have a dog. And that they cannot be discriminated against even when if they're already living in the unit and if they acquire that pet during their tenancy, or even if they move to another location. So that's something that people should be aware of as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And that touches on the reasonable accommodations and modifications that tenants can request from landlords. So a reasonable accommodation is a request to have a change in the rules or the policy. Again, a great example of this is the assistance animal that you mentioned. And that is having an assistance animal where the landlord is not allowed to ask for a certification for the animal, and they're not allowed to charge a deposit based on that. Another example is asking for a lease application that's in a larger print if they have a visual impairment. An example of a modification is a request to change the physical structure. So this is going to look like grab bars in the bathroom, replacing doorknobs with levers, removing below-counter cabinets. And there are details about the costs for this and what is reasonable, right? So to be reasonable, it can't cause undue financial burden on the landlord, can't change the basic nature of the housing program, can't harm or damage other people who live in the area, the other tenants. And of course, it has to be technologically possible. So there are, further details about accommodations and modifications are addressed with specific circumstances, but this is a big one. If you or someone you know have had someone that's struggled with this, with a landlord, please let us know. We're happy to mediate and find a solution. And again, touching on that service animal, so again, no extra fees or deposits. The landlord needs to respond in a reasonable time. They can't just let it sit out there forever. And they cannot be denied occupancy. So if it's a building that says no pets, but a service animal is there for a disabled person, they have to make that exception. Okay, so many of the tests, so we have testers in our program, and many of the testers on our team wanted to become fair housing testers because of their experience being denied housing because they had children. So familial status, it just means having children under 18 living in the dwelling. This includes pregnant women or anyone that's in the process of adopting a child. Many housing providers are a little more bold in discriminating with families with children. They publish ads that say no kids or adults only, making the exception of the housing for older persons. Doing things like charging a per person application fee that puts a financial burden on families with children. Having gender-specific occupancy rules, having specific rules that treat children differently than adults. In one community, we actually saw a sign that said, no kids playing on the grass. So that's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. New Jersey has its, next one. New Jersey, like Councilwoman Baskerville said, New Jersey has its own set of protected classes. And some big ones to note are sexual orientation, gender identity, and source of lawful income. Last April, the Division on Civil Rights sent over 30 cease and desist letters out to landlords and property managers throughout the state because they were advertising illegally on Craigslist by saying no Section 8, or basically telling people that they don't accept federally assisted rents. We see this on Craigslist still, unfortunately. When we, as an organization, contact housing providers who have these ads up, telling them there's a violation, here's the law, please take it down, a lot of them just aren't aware. And this is part of us working together as a community to provide support for these housing providers, educating them about their responsibilities. We found that a lot of them, once they're informed, they do take it down. But unfortunately, there are many, many times when a housing provider isn't as receptive and flexible. And that's where we come in. So if a housing provider has a pattern or a policy of behavior that cuts off housing to people, you have a right to do something about it. And if you have been in this situation before, I encourage you to reach out to me. These flyers are on the table over there, and some of you have grabbed them. But you can, when you call, we'll go over your situation. We can mediate the situation between you and a landlord where it's appropriate. We can advocate on your behalf, making a phone call, sending a letter. A lot of times just having someone, an organization just say, hey, this person is having this situation, they need this reasonable modification, it's required under the Fair Housing Act, that produces results. So we don't run directly to filing lawsuits or things like that. If it's something that we can handle and keep people in the unit and keep it solid, we try to do that. We also, when it is applicable, we can connect people to legal services. A lot of times we have people call and they're having a landlord-tenant dispute. Maybe there is an eviction on the table. Maybe they received a notice to quit. So we do have resources that we can connect people with. And then finally, we do testing. And so testing, again, gives us that bird's eye view of what's happening. It's similar to mystery shopping, but with housing. So while testing might seem misleading, it was actually validated by the Supreme Court over 30 years ago. The most common test I conduct is a paired test with a control tester and a protected class tester. So in this example, we're investigating a disability discrimination. The control tester and protected class are identical in every way. They're going to have similar credit scores. They're going to make similar amounts of money. All of those qualifiers are going to be very similar. And then I send these two testers to go visit the housing provider to inquire about housing. They record their experience. They submit those reports to me. And then I just look at them. I look at them side by side, and I see if there's a difference of treatment. Is the protected class tester getting steered? Are there any sort of discrimination elements happening here? If we do find discrimination, I'm going to test again. I'm going to send out a new set of testers, testing again for here, disability, just to gather more evidence. And we also want to ensure accuracy in the test results because we're humans. We can't control absolutely everything, so we do multiple tests just to ensure that accuracy. And then once we confirm that discrimination absolutely is happening, there's a pattern of discrimination, we file the complaint with HUD. We help aggrieved persons file complaints. We can file on behalf of people. Again, if there is a person who doesn't want their name associated with it, they want to remain anonymous, we can file for them under citizen action, or we can guide them through filing an anonymous complaint with HUD. We also take in complaints anonymously. We research and investigate any complaint that comes in. So when it is possible, when a complaint comes in and when it is possible, we send testers out, again, to have evidence so when we submit our complaint to HUD, they have it right there for them, and they can take the action that they need to take. So there are timelines for filing a complaint. And this is information we'll give if you ever need to file a complaint, but it's 1 year from the date of the last act of discrimination to file an administrative complaint with HUD. It's 2 years from the last act of discrimination to file a civil lawsuit. Any person involved with a housing transaction is responsible for upholding fair housing laws. 50 years later, we're still working for fair housing because housing and the lack of housing affects every aspect of a person's life and their future. We also, as I'm doing here, we also offer education to organizations, community groups, church groups, housing providers. We want everyone to know their rights and their responsibilities under the Fair Housing Act to make our communities more integrated. Okay, so there is my information. I know there's a lot of information, but does anyone have any questions right off the bat? Yes.
You talked about the fact that you can't limit children, you can't limit different groups. How do they handle things with senior housing, with these adult communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is one of the exemptions under the Fair Housing Act, but those adult communities, they have to be certified by HUD, and they also, I think it's 80% have to be over 55, so you can still have that 20%. But yeah, it is something that they have to apply, and it's not just you can't just slap on an adults only. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Go ahead.
I have a question. I get confused a little bit about compassion animals versus service animals. Because I do work in real estate. Someone came in and they're like, I have a compassion animal, and they were doing a discount. They were asking for a discount, and I was like, I think it should be a service animal. I mean, I'm just not sure. Are they? Because I think you can just give anybody can give a certificate to say they're like, yeah.
Right, and actually, even under the Fair Housing Act, as of now, you don't have to provide that documentation for the service animal, but that is only applicable to someone who has a disability. So, it can be perceived, it could be a history of having a disability or having an actual disability, but that's where that falls under.
So, yeah, that's the exception. Yes.
Reasonable accommodations for the disabled is a very complex subject, both in employment and in housing.
Sure.
But you make it sound pretty good. But I wonder, okay, because it's a reasonableness test. Leaving aside putting up grab bars in the shower kind of thing, more expensive things like ramp access, like widening doorways, does HUD actually get remedies requiring employers to do ramp access and widening doorways and things like that?
Well, employers I can't speak to.
I meant landlords.
Okay, so the reasonable modification, so the physical change on the property, is at the cost of the tenant. So there are programs out there that can help tenants, but the modification can't cause an undue financial burden on the landlord.
Can't cause any burden on the landlord, is that correct?
I think the term is undue.
I know, but in reality.
Right,
do they
right.
ever have to pay?
Well, this is a complicated question, but so the reasonableness is what comes into question here. I'm not in the guidelines for the Fair Housing Act. The financial burden is on the tenant, but specific cases are tried in court, and what happens. But that is when they make the application to do the reasonable modification. The tenant has to come up with the funds to pay for that. I'm sorry, I feel like I botched the question a little bit. If anyone has anything to add on the panel.
We try to add, if you take a look at the housing stock in Montclair, you've got a lot of old houses, 100 years old plus, okay? So, when you start adding ramps, and the ramps are the bigger issue, but widening doorways, hallways within a structure, there's probably a fair expense associated with that because of the older construction. What they've been doing with some of the newer construction, some of the major development that's going on, they've been requiring the developer to make sure that those requirements are part of the development, part of the architecture. So they can be easily adjusted if someone requires to have a parking or townhouse, whatever the case might be, for someone that has that.
I just want to add on that, federally and state, the Americans with Disability Act and the state equivalent requires new construction to be accessible and reasonably made accessible. It doesn't require that anything affordable housing be made available that's accessible.
Well, some of the units that are part of the set-aside, they have to have the accommodations one way or the other, even if they're going to be affordable. I think what we're trying to do from a development standpoint is make sure that those are also providing access to people that have need.
Again, it's more optimistic than my experience. Not on my own behalf, it's not my issue, but for new buildings that are approved by the town, of course they have to be accessible, physically accessible, as Americans with Disabilities Act, etc. But if they set aside 20%, for example, is kind of the goal often, that the developer has to make as affordable housing, there's nothing that gives disabled people preference in the lotteries or other mechanisms to get that housing. Okay, so there's implicit, perhaps unintended, perhaps, discrimination, so that if you're in this town and you need accessible, affordable housing, you're in a lottery with everybody else that doesn't necessarily have a specific need.
That is very true. However, to answer the first part of the question, it is a requirement that it be ADA compliant if it is new construction. But that's a very good point you raised, and I really don't know about that.
Yeah, what you said is absolutely true, and I'm excited to say that we are revisiting how we allocate our affordable housing in the township and the housing that's set aside. And so definitely, for me, that's something that I'm very passionate about. I can assure you that we will be having those conversations and trying to do better. When we're looking at Montclair 50 years later, and Montclair has had a Fair Housing Commission in this township, thanks to a great gentleman named Sir Charles Baskerville, Jr., who happened to be my dad, one of the founding members of the commission back in the late 60s. And so for all of the years of work here, we look around Montclair, and I certainly am proud of a lot of things that we're doing, but I think that we're nowhere near where we could be or even where we should be, in my opinion. Some of the things that Ms. Smith talked about in terms of discrimination, people look around, I get phone calls all the time. People have concerns, maybe not so much today about, well, I didn't get a house because I was black or brown, but I often hear people say that they're very concerned, for example, about our zoning ordinances. So she discussed some of the ways that people discriminate and oftentimes stay under the radar screen, but there are other ways. She talked about the subprime lending and when people's credit rates are the same and one person is denied and another person isn't. But nationally, people are looking at the way properties are zoned. So for example, if you have zoning in a township that allows for very, very large properties and very spacious properties and would make it almost prohibitive for people of lower or moderate income to get into that neighborhood, some might raise a question if that is a tactic to continue segregated housing. So the second part of this whole fair housing thing is the whole idea that the intent is to abolish segregated residence and to bring all people together and the right to live in a community. And a lot of people say in Montclair that they share that vision, and people say, oh yeah, well you can go wherever your pocketbook can take you. But when you really look at that, that's not really true. And again, when you go to the banks and they say, you know, whatever, find ways to make you not eligible for a loan at the same rate as somebody that has the same credit as you, or if people, Ms. Smith mentioned steering, and she mentioned steering in one way, but steering can go both ways, because I hear in Montclair a lot of times when white individuals come into our wonderful township and they're interested in purchasing a home in the Fourth Ward of Montclair, more specifically in the south end of Montclair, where we have very beautiful homes, that they've been steered to don't go down there. So steering works both ways, and that's why I think it's so important that we share education. Those of us that understand that these discriminations are unlawful, it's incumbent upon us to share that and let people know. If a realtor says something like that, you know, to you, we need to tell people that that's unlawful. You know, but those are ways that people often overlook in terms of things that are in place that discriminate. When you have very small properties, or you have a neighborhood that has probably smaller plots of land than in other parts of a township, and a community says, okay, now we're going to give further permission to further subdivide those already small plots of land in a township that has very massive and wonderful estates in other areas, one might question, is that another way to continue to perpetuate a neighborhood that is of moderate and perhaps moderate and low income neighborhoods, versus maybe looking at another neighborhood where they have massive plots of land and saying, if we give permission to subdivide the massive plots of land into smaller sizes, maybe some of the people that have historically been locked into a certain neighborhood by virtue of the plots of lands might be able to move up onto a hill and have a view from the hill. There are a lot of things that I think we have not in this township exhausted, and I'm very happy to be serving on the Housing Commission and the leadership of the two people, and working with people in town that are committed and dedicated and want to question and challenge and push the envelope. Sure, nationally, we are leaps and bounds, hands down, above most. And I'm very excited about that. But I don't want us to get to a point of complacency on anything. I recognize our Assistant Superintendent of Education, Dr. Kendra Johnson. I listened to her last night talking about the ills of becoming complacent in terms of educating our students. And it's the same for me in terms of housing. So I'd like to hear from you. Yes.
I'd just like to say that in Montclair at this particular time, there's a lot of things going on as far as the buildings that they're building and the rents that they're charging. The people that live in Montclair, moderate, they can't afford to stay here. The housing is going up. They're not going to be able to purchase housing. And you're talking about redlining. If they find that a realtor is redlining, you're not supposed to do that. As a realtor, you cannot redline. You can't even tell a person that you are, if they ask you how's the neighborhood, is it a bad neighborhood, you can't tell them. You can't give that information out as a realtor. You ask them to research it. You can, do research online. You can call the Chamber of Commerce. You can call the police department. But there's very little information that we can give out to people as far as that goes. I don't know how the affordable housing is going to continue in Montclair. Back in 1979, they got rid of all of those houses on Bloomfield Avenue. They put the Muse there. They displaced the people, they told them that once they build it, they could come back. They can't come back. It's a lottery. Anybody has the right to sign up for housing, affordable housing in Montclair. It doesn't matter where you live. And it's a lottery, so it doesn't mean that because you live here that you're going to be picked to stay here. And that's how a lot of people got pushed out of Montclair, and that's happening now. Even with Section 8. Section 8, you can't afford an apartment in Montclair. One bedroom, because the amount that they allow you, it just doesn't work. So there's a lot that we have to work on here.
Thank you very much. Anything else?
I'd just like to add that, in all actuality, I think people have a utopic view of Montclair, and they like to hold on to like a cognitive dissonance or so to speak. But I remember back in the 60s, I lived on Grove Street, but near to Bloomfield Avenue, in an apartment building that no longer exists. And my mother was very active in PTA and eclectic. And she was actually told by one of my classmates' mothers, who lived on Columbus Avenue, further down Grove Street, that there was an agreement that they wouldn't sell the colors on the block. That was in the 60s. My cousin sold our family home on Central Avenue 3 years back, and she called a realtor in Upper Montclair. She was looking for an apartment. And so on the phone, her voice has a certain tone to it. So the woman told, oh, come and just park your car, we'll go right in my car, and we'll be fine, and I'll show you a nice apartment like Montclair. So when my cousin got there, my cousin is very tall, beautiful, very dark-skinned, and, a real presence. And the woman looked at her and said, oh, well, you'd probably be more comfortable in your own car. Red flag number one. So, no problems, my cousin gets her car, and she drives her down to Valley Road. This is just a couple of years ago. Drives to the Valley Road across from Lawrence, and shows her in a house. They get out of the car. My cousin said, this is not Upper Montclair. She said, oh, it absolutely is. She said, now we live around the corner. She said, this is not Upper Montclair. And I'm telling you, this is Upper Montclair. My cousin said, I'm telling you, it's not Upper Montclair. And the woman said to her, and how would you know? My cousin said, because I live around the corner. And they called her like a million times. And that's why I said, if you want to take this further, you can. It's red light is against the law. And the part about it, I work with the social justice department. Red lighting was government sanctioned. It was right in the wording of HUD and the FHA. Red lighting. They were not to give loans to people of color. In Levittown and places like that. It was everything white. And tragically, that's the underlying essence of Montclair. That there's certain areas where black should be, certain areas where white should be. And it still exists.
Two things I want to say, but with regard to the realtors, this may or may not come to a shock to a lot of people. That's still happening in present day. And so I don't mind saying that that is illegal. And if you hear of anyone doing that, or if you know of anyone doing that, it is illegal. It is a violation of the federal fair housing law. And also, if a person is a realtor, they take a code of ethics, just like doctors and attorneys do. And the first article is do no harm to the public, right? And then there are several others. If you find that that is happening to you, because it happened to me when I bought my house here, okay? But I didn't know anything then. That was before I was licensed. If you find that, you file a complaint with the National Association of Realtors and or the local realtor board, either in this municipality or wherever else, okay? And then there is a complaint process that happens. There is a process that's internal. They have certain boards that the realtor would need to go before in order to address the complaint. And realtors can be fined upwards of $10,000 per incident and or lose their license with the New Jersey Department of Banking and Insurance Real Estate Commission. Each realtor has a registration number, and this is really point to the gentleman's question is what's happening with that information once it gets sent in to the administrator? Mr. Scott?
I just want to add that I've lived in town for 68 years, 4 generations. I was fortunate enough to acquire my parents' home, so I've been a landlord for about 35 years. I've had the opportunity to have a lot of great tenants. And one thing I've always done from an advertising standpoint, I used to be old school, I put it in the star budget and things like that. I never dealt with a realtor. So when people would call me, I would just give them the information, invite them to come in for an interview. But one thing I really realized over the last 5 to 10 years, they would get a sense of who I was just by the address of my property. Because in a lot of cases, they didn't want, from a rental standpoint, they didn't want to move to the south area. I'm not a slumlord, I had great units, okay, but they would get a sense that, or you're on the other side of Bloomfield Avenue, or you're on the Elm Street side, and that side of the sort of conversation. We make appointments and would never show up, okay. But I would say in the last 5 years, that has definitely changed because we've had a complete turnaround in the Fourth Ward. Everything is hot real estate from a rental standpoint and even from a purchase standpoint. A lot of development is going on because people are realizing they're getting a lot more for their money than what they may acquire if they move to a different area of the township. So some of that is changing a little bit. So there might be some issues still out there, but I do notice that the people seeking rental units or purchasing property are looking at it from a pocketbook standpoint and getting much more for their money from an investment standpoint. So it has changed a little bit there, I must admit. I've got, as I mentioned, I've been fortunate to live in town to see people exiting and they're coming right back. Okay, so it has changed quite a bit.
Yes.
I want to pick up on what Mr. Scott said. I'm with Home Corps.
This is Mr. David Grill, and I was going to introduce you, but now that you're speaking, and I'm really excited. I don't blame you. He's with Home Corps, and did you want to come up here and speak a little bit? Okay, all right.
Right before Christmas, woman came into the Home Corps office. You can just see she was totally stressed out, and she was looking to see whether we had an apartment for her. Her story is that she has a full-time job. She works in a call center. Works in a call center, lives on Pine Street. And she found out that when her lease is up at the end of March, her rent is going to be jacked up to $1,400 a month. So this is for a lot of us who've been around for a while, the general response to that is Pine Street. So that's the other side, that's the flip side of what's happening down at the south end in the Fourth Ward. With property values going up, we're going to see rents in areas that have been classically affordable disappear. We're going to see housing prices get to the point where people, middle class people can't afford them. What we see from Home Corps is that when we try to acquire a property to renovate it, a tear down or a gut rehab can cost $300,000 now. And then you have to put in another $200,000 or $300,000, and then somehow get enough subsidy to make the math work so that we can rent it or sell it at affordable rates. It's getting harder and harder and harder in town. And, on the one hand, it's great that values are going up. On the other, the flip side of that is we're going to continue to see people being forced out of town because they can't afford to stay here.
And I would like to say, no, but you're absolutely right, and I think that I feel very comfortable that this council is really, for the majority, committed to trying to look at our options in terms of providing housing that is affordable and providing housing in other ways that are affordable for
our firefighters, our teachers, those people in the community, our workforce housing. And so we're still discussing that, so I'm not at liberty to make any hot news flash tonight, but I feel very good about where we are. It appears at this point in time that we may have reached our COA requirement for affordable housing, and it appears that we may be moving in a direction where we will be more at liberty to become more creative about how we designate housing, and I feel very strongly that the majority of the council is committed to trying to find ways that we can keep our Montclair residents in town and in place, and this will be a first for the township.
I mean, as an organization, we would love to get out from under this lottery system. You know, just be able to prioritize for residents and prioritize for municipal workers.
And I think that I can say I personally agree wholeheartedly with that.
Well, you've been beating me up over that for years.
You're right, and that's why I think that we're finally at a point in time where we may be able to have a little bit more liberty at how we do that. Yes, Woody.
Now you're talking about affordable housing, is that, you're talking about the lottery, how are you going to get rid of it? Is that a federal thing that you have to fight with, as far as that's concerned, because of laws and everything else like that? That's going to take a lot of time to do. And sometimes people ain't got time, you know, when their rents go up and everything else like that. And when you talk about, you know, other things, and I mean, the last time we were talking about, what was it? We were talking about rent control. And I asked the question last time about what is the definition of that, because I worked within the city, it was a different definition. I don't know if New Jersey's going to have a different definition of that. Then it was rent control, rent stabilization. Then when somebody moved, they charged much rent they wanted to. And the thing with landlords were you had to give them an incentive for people to stay, like senior citizens and stuff like that. They got like a tax abatement and stuff like that. So I don't know what the difference is and how is that coming along as far as that's concerned when you're talking about that. And what's that definition is from Jersey to New York, because when I worked there was a lot of problems with that, you know, and stuff like that, and you know, and I just haven't really heard anything more about that and what's happening.
So, to answer the first part of your question about how we're going to do that, the only thing that I can say right now is that there are lawsuits all up and down the state, and so in terms of how each municipality is going to end up shaping shaping how they're going to do their affordable housing, I don't have that answer right now. I know pretty much where Montclair stands in the direction that I believe we should be going in, but I can't discuss certain things at this point in time because it's in litigation.
No, I understand, but what I was just basically, all the stuff we're talking about, like the same thing with the supermarket.
I was going to answer you.
No, just real fast, just saying, you know, it's all going to take a lot of time. You know, and
Okay.
how much time do you have as a renter when these things are changing on you, and you really can't stay, you're going to have to freaking move.
Okay, and so was there a question, or were you just sharing information?
No, I just wanted to know the question about the whole process and everything is like that. Like you're working on it, it's going to take a lot of time and stuff like that. That's what I'm saying. That's the question.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Well, currently, from an NAACP standpoint, the Housing Commission, we've had an initiative out in the township to take a look at beginning the conversation about considering, you can call it rent control or rent stabilization, because before you get into which is whatever the case might be, you know, you're looking for a moderate rent control process. A moderate rent control process would absolutely require that the township put in place a complete inventory of all the rental units within the township, from 2 families and above. And the 2-family units, if they're owner occupied, they could be exempt. So there's a lot of things that you have to really work through the process to put a real rent stabilization or rent control process in place. You also have to put in place a rent review board. If if someone of that being a tenant comes to the rent review board on an annual basis, and they want to increase their rent 25 or 50%, you'd have to have a pretty good justification on how you could require a tenant to pay that amount of money above his previous year. And they may not be able to, if this is something that could be put in place. And let me just preface it a little bit. There's about 120 municipalities and towns within the state of New Jersey that they do have some form of rent control. And this is nothing new to the state of New Jersey. In Montclair has neighbors, Cedar Grove, West Orange, South Orange, Maplewood, Caldwell, Bloomfield, they have rent control. So we're not talking, and I think we had this conversation before, we're not talking about an Irvington, a Newark, or Patterson. You're talking about communities that have had rent control in place for many years and has not taken anything away from the growth and viability of those communities. And I would almost venture a little bit, I might be going out on a limb, I think it may have improved its diversity, because if people have an understanding of what they can afford on a year-by-year basis, I think that that's something that works to their advantage. Montclair does not have rent control, and I would say over the last 15 to 20 years, we've lost a lot of our diversity because people cannot afford to live in this township. But there's a question in my mind how this could play out. But from an NAACP standpoint, we put together a full package online. We're working with Atlantic Cities. If you picked up my package, you see the initial information. There's a website you can go out on, and you can view the information, and you can voice your opinion, whether you want to support the extension of a further conversation about rent control in the township of Montclair or not. Because we have to have the buy-in of not only the renters, but happens to be 42-43% of the population in Montclair, but the landlords, even these single-family residents, they want to feel that they're not going to be put at a disadvantage from a property value. I hope I answered some of your questions, because I know you talked about New York, and this approach that we're taking is not like New York.
I know it's not like New York. I'm just saying, I just wanted to know what the definition was.
There is no
That's all I'm
single
saying.
definition.
I know it's not like New York, that's not the issue.
But the last time that we were here, I mentioned that there is no single definition across the board about what rent control is. Rent control
is whatever that municipality shapes it into. And so in terms of how long something, would take like that, the first thing we would have to do in Montclair is to establish that the will of the people is that they want rent control or rent stabilization. And thus far, Mr. Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, we're not getting an overwhelming response that people are interested in pursuing rent control or rent stabilization here in Montclair. Just like when the document that we are now reviewing with the Housing Commission first came out in, what year was that? Many years ago, like in 1980 or something like that. At that time, there was also not the will of the majority of the people in town to pursue that. And so step number one in this township would be to get a response that indicates that the township should pursue that. And to date, we don't have that. Yes, sir.
Okay, rent control, okay, that's great for ensuring income diversity and probably ethnic diversity as well. But from the standpoint of the property owners, it would be great if you had rent stabilization, but also real estate tax stabilization, because again, the property values of Montclair and surrounding towns are going up. You have periodic revaluation, so you have the value push, which is raising the expense for every homeowner, and I think that would be a concern with regard to rent control. Not that they would want it, but without the abatement of the push of their expenses, they may not be receptive to a cap on their income, which rent control would represent, a cap on their income to retain tenants. And, you know, so you know, you're talking about a cap, but not a cap on a cap on income, but not a cap on expenses, which is, you know, property taxes, which are driven by, you know, a revaluation and so on and so forth. So in California, they have the proposition whatever that actually put a cap or something on property taxes. And so again, so you've eliminated that expense push, and therefore it's more realistic to have a income cap. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, Ms. Malloy.
Two things. I think the conversation that we're having about rent stabilization, rent control is an important one, and it should continue. And to Councilwoman Baskerville's point about the municipality making a decision, an ordinance would need to be put in place for a cap or a percentage on rent control. And your point regarding the taxes and things of that nature is a valid one. But what homeowners can do is they can file an appeal. And oftentimes, most homeowners don't do that. I can't speak for everyone, but that's something that perhaps a conversation with local homeowners would be a good one, to have a conversation about how to address that. And if you do have concerns about those things, you can certainly contact your local council person or go to a municipal meeting or the tax office and pick up an application.
Milt?
I don't think that the appeals process for real estate is really a good one. I mean, I had, somebody has to pick it up. There's a budget in town which drives the property tax and the tax base. So for every appeal, that means all the rest of us have to pick up the difference. So your taxes go up when somebody else's appeal is successful. And I refuse to do that because I don't want to burden, you know, I want to pay my fair share. But at the same time, you know, I have concerns about real estate taxes as well. But if I get an appeal, that means that Audrey's going to have to pick up some of it, and William, and everybody else in the room. So the more appeals there are, it's a very, very selfish kind of thing to do when we can all act together to control real estate taxes by controlling the budget. So if you can reduce the budget, that means your taxes are going to go down because of what happens. But also the assessing process has to be more fair to address the issues around the town as to where the properties are that should be taxed more.
I agree 100% with you, and in so many ways, that's what I said. I mean, a broader conversation with homeowners. I mean, that's a conversation that maybe a municipality-wide, I don't know. The tax appeals process is not fair. And unfortunately, sometimes when that happens, I mean, they don't even know what's going on the inside of the property. And so only a homeowner or an attorney for the homeowner can do that process. So if you choose not to, that's certainly your choice. If you choose to do so, that is certainly your legal right. I'm not an attorney, but that's a conversation that will need to happen. So to your point, and the statement that I made about going to the municipality, when they do the budget review, go to the meeting. It's online, it's a public document. Look at it, review it, you're paying your taxes, and you have a say. I mean, it's a conversation, and it's a very arduous process, but at least the conversation, which was my point in the statement that I made, could be had.
And I believe the process, the budgeting process starts next month.
Yes.
We already,
So, it's important to use a point. You know, I've gone to some of the meetings, you know, it's a difficult thing. I agree with you 200%. You've been here long enough to believe me, I sympathize you all 100%. But also being a homeowner and also a landlord, I've got properties on both sides of the spectrum at that point. It's an investment. Okay, it's an investment. I've been fortunate enough to be able to buy a home in Montclair At one time, I didn't think I was going to be able to continue to pay the taxes. To be transparent, I was fortunate enough after a reassessment, my property taxes went down. So, you know, and I didn't have to do an appeal. Okay, so, you know, it can work in both camps. But if you feel as if your taxes are really getting out of control, you have to take that step and go for that appeal, because that's the only way you're going to be able to bring something to the table and get those taxes down. Because if you accept it, well, you've accepted it. You can't really get around that. Okay, but, you know, there has always been, for many years, a concern of the value of the houses in one part of town opposed to the value of the houses in another part of this township. And in my particular case, I think I benefited from that, because those taxes absolutely came down. Okay? And I'm sure someone used my property in their appeals process, okay, and may have got their property taxes to come down as well. So, you know, it's something to pursue. You have to concern about.
Just about the tax appeal process, my input on it as an attorney who does tax appeals in town. It actually, you know, it works for people, and it's, I don't want to say that it's unfair, but really what we're looking at when we do a tax appeal is your property valuation, and you're looking at the comps as to what the value of other properties are, and use basically, you know, sales as what those comps are. When we were back in 2008, and everybody's properties were over-evaluated, the only way to get the evaluations down properly were for a majority of Montclair residents to go and appeal their taxes. And that was what forced the 2012 reassessment, which brought down a lot of people's property taxes back, or valuations down in certain parts of the town, and push those ones up that should be up a little bit higher, and cause the balancing effect of the property taxes. Now, we've had a period of time where property values have gone up over the past 4 or 5 years, and we're in a real estate boom. That's why we had a new evaluation. But if your evaluation you believe is unfair, I think it's your right and a benefit not just to yourself, but also to your neighbor, even though there might be pressure put on other people with their taxes. It will help the town make the adjustment. And really, as we've just discussed, once the town gets into balance with the valuation of the properties, then the budget kicks in. So in order to bring the taxes to meet the budget, either the taxes will go up or the taxes will go down. And at this point in time, until the budget is determined for the next year, we don't really know how this current valuation is going to affect us. But I would say if you believe your property was unfairly valued, or you don't believe the valuation was correct, you do have the right to and should pursue a tax.
Thank you for that input. I'm going to try to draw us back to discussion on fair housing in case people are sitting here and they have questions and concerns. While we have some experts here, I think all of these topics that we're discussing are interrelated in some way and very important. You can't really have a discussion about one without the other, especially when so many people are looking around Montclair and trying to figure out 50 years after the passing of the Fair Housing Act and its amendments, how we still have what appears to be a color line or a socioeconomic line or whatever, so they are all interrelated, and I welcome them. I just want to make sure there aren't people that are still sitting here now that wanted to either share or ask questions. Yes.
I wanted to share, I don't live in Montclair. I actually am a CRA loan officer for M&T Bank, nasty bank. But we are one of the banks that specifically address the needs of the community. As I mentioned, I'm a CRA loan officer, that's Community Reinvestment Act. And we purchased Hudson City, you may have heard about that. That's how we got a presence in New Jersey, because Hudson City was fine with redlining. And because of that, we were able to purchase that bank, have this presence, and we provide the community with subsidies, grants for purchasing. And I think one of the evils of discrimination is really a lack of social capital. People don't know what's really available. And so they are in their own circle of not knowing, and they're missing out on wonderful opportunities. And so I don't know if there's some way to help spread the word about what these opportunities are. We all know who's in office, and regardless of your political leanings, we don't know how long these things are going to last. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is being gutted, and so a lot of these efforts are going to be taken away. So I'm trying to get the word out as much as possible that there are lenders out here who are trying to help people and focused on helping people in the community get housing, find out where grants are, find a way to help them, educate them. I have the good fortune of working with the people at Home Corp, which is doing an amazing job for the community. But we still need to all be ambassadors, I think, for the community. And I'm open to ideas or participating with groups just to make sure they're aware of what's available.
No, I really appreciate that, and that's one of the reasons that I thought it was important that we have this type of convening, so people will step up, such as yourself and others in the room, and share and offer opportunities. Twice, I believe I heard you mention grants, and so already I'm very interested in learning more about what type of grants you have, what can we do with them, and I certainly personally would like to connect with you and get your information if you wanted to share it to the group. So if others are also interested in connecting, that's what these forums are for. They're for information sharing, and so I thank you.
Yes.
I want to come back to an important existing limitation on rent increases statewide. I was out of the room a couple minutes. I don't think you dealt with this, if you did, stop me. But if you're covered under the multiple dwelling code, which is the building of 3 units or more in the state of New Jersey, statewide, including Montclair, then there's an underlying thing that you can't be evicted just because the landlord wants to bring somebody in that's going to pay more, or without cause, as long as you're paying the rent. I mean, there's questions of cause and things. You can't be evicted just because the landlord wants to bring in somebody who's going to pay more. An important thing about rent increases, if the landlord were free to increase your rent by 25%, that's the same thing as evicting you. So that becomes an implicit confiscatory violation. Now, there's no hard and fast number, but if it's a crazy increase that can't be supported, then that's in effect an eviction of you, and you're protected statewide as long as multiple family, 3 units or more, unless the landlord is bringing in himself or herself, not their cousin or their neighbor or their best friend. Unless they're coming in on their own for themselves to take over a unit, you can't be thrown out. Now, that's limited because it's multiple dwellings only, but it exists, and a lot of people and a lot of landlords aren't aware of it. It's important to know that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roy and Ms. Allen. 2 things. Home Corp does work with NNT. They do a first-time home buyer seminar. So does Citizen Action, and Home Corp is in partnership with Essex Community Land Trust, which is also another nonprofit agency here in town that does home buyer seminars, and you can get that information from Ms. Wiseman. Regarding evictions, that's very true. However, if a landlord is receiving federal or state subsidies and a tenant refuses to recertify, which is an annual documentation process, they can be evicted. Okay? And the rent will go to market rate depending on the type of funds they are receiving. Okay? But to your point, it's very true. But if a landlord is receiving state or federal subsidies for any one particular unit or building, and the tenant is failing to do their annual recertification, doesn't matter what kind of income source they have, this is not fair housing discrimination, it's just regulatory procedures. that has to happen. So in some cases, if a tenant fails to do that, depending on where the funding source is coming from, there's a process, there's a due notice process, but the unit can go from affordable to market rate. So it depends on where the income source is coming from for the landlord, but for a private person, that's certainly true.
Can I just say, the tenant is doing all the things they're supposed to.
Can't hear you.
If the tenant's doing all the things they're supposed to, they go through the certification process. Now, my understanding that the landlord cannot raise the rent, they use this term, an unconscionable amount of money. Now, what is that amount? Well, that amount will come into discussion is 25%, 50%. I believe you can go through a process of negotiation with some board. I'm not sure what that board might be, because if you're dealing from a state level or above, then you've got some process that the landlord and the tenant has to go through for them to justify an increase of that magnitude. Okay, so we cannot go just by the landlord saying, I want to increase it, 25 or 50% because he wants to. There's a process that they should have to go through. I'm not sure if I can put it in on this one.
I'm not a landlord.
It's not regulated housing or federally funded or Section 8 housing. It's just a regular tenant paying rent. You then wind up in a tenant, and that is you either mediate the rent, or the judge would make a determination on whether it's unconscionable and burdensome. And we use different types of evidence, fair market value, what the rentals in the area are. But in New Jersey, no one can be evicted without cause. It has to be generally a cause. When it's a rental situation, it's non-payment or non-renewal, but every tenant should be offered a renewal with a rental amount that is reasonable. And then if it's not a rent issue, whether it be a breach of the lease, too many occupants in the apartment, following rules, whatever, that becomes a holdover type of situation. And that tenant is given due process to defend themselves from those cases of action. Yeah.
Well, there is a landlord-tenant association in Montclair, and if a tenant feels that their rent is being increased unconscionably, they can go to the landlord-tenant and be heard, and the landlord, they will call in the landlord and try and work that out.
So before we adjourn, I was going to tell you what our local agencies, organizations, committees, and commissions are that we have in place that would be very helpful. And Ms. Curry just mentioned our Montclair Township Landlord Tenant Committee, and that committee has been chaired for many years by a very knowledgeable and wonderful person, Ms. Ruth Taylor. And the information about the Landlord Tenant Association can be found on the website for the Township of Montclair. And it's an excellent first start. It's a great start if you have a problem with your landlord, or if you have questions. It's also a great start if you're not certain if something is discriminatory and you need to pursue some other things. And it's free. It's a free service. And you don't have to make an appointment. There's a schedule for the landlord-tenant. If you're going to bring your landlord and you're going to have an actual mediation, then you would need to try to speak with Ms. Taylor before that and set something up. And so you may be able to resolve some of these issues, starting with our Landlord-Tenant Association. And if not, that's when you would go and call somebody like Mr. Burr or somebody, get some legal advice and pursue other means. But oftentimes here in the township, we've been able to resolve things through mediation with the Landlord-Tenant Association. You also heard that we have the Housing Commission. We have both of the co-chair for the Housing Commission in Township. They welcome people coming to that committee to learn more, even if you want to sign up to be on any of these committees and commissions, if you say, gee, I can really step out and join one of these committees and make a difference in somebody else's life, that might be an opportunity. We also have our Section 8 HUD housing, and Mr. Bruce Morgan, who is not here. I'm not certain. I'm sure something happened. I saw him this evening. He was one of our panel members, a wealth of knowledge. He was going to share with us all about HUD and how that is so interrelated with the Fair Housing Act and with discrimination, and even with our community development block grants, federal funds that we get into Montclair. Because it's so important to understand that, and you look and you say, well, we've been getting these dollars, and we should be able to look and say how they're contributing to furthering fair housing in Montclair. And that's a key ingredient. If we constantly are checking ourselves to say, okay, well, for the last X number of years, we've had a Fair Housing Commission, we've been getting community development block grants, we've been doing all these things, let's sit back and look and make a list of the things that we've done well, and then some things that we really need to focus on because our work is far from done. Let's see, we can always go to the Montclair NAACP. They have a housing commission, Mr. Scott, the chair of that, and they have a lot of information there that might be helpful as well. And what other organizations am I forgetting? The township provides?
Well, from a township standpoint, if you have a complaint from a landlord tenant standpoint, if you call right into the township clerk, she'll record that information and pass it on to them. And so they're very serious about keeping track of any concerns you might have. It's just one other thing I wanted to add to from a funding standpoint. There's an initiative out going around right now from the state level that they're trying to get Governor Murphy to reinstate $600 million for affordable housing for people with disabilities.
Yes.
And I'll send that information to Councilwoman Baskerville, because from an individual standpoint, you can either call the governor's office or you can email the governor's office to say that you really want to make sure that this money is reinstated because it has been removed over the last 10 years. And you want to get it to pass people. Okay, but we want to make sure that those types of funds are put back in place because they will have a direct effect on a lot of these programs that support affordable housing, people with disabilities, or whatever the case is. And that is definitely seriously needed money in the state of New Jersey because it has been completed quite a bit over the last few weeks. So I'll pass that information on to
I have it. Thank you so much.
We can just distribute it out. People can, just from a personal standpoint, if you don't want to go into the computer, you can just call directly into the governor's office and say, we want you to support that additional funding because I believe the budget process is going to start, or he's going to mention the budget, I think, around the March 13th timeframe. So you want to get in his ear to make sure that those sorts of things are funded as well.
Yes, sir.
One last comment. Montclair is booming with market rate housing development, and I was wondering if any of the developers are being made to set aside or accommodate the need for affordable housing in terms of having their mega projects green-lighted. I just wondered if that's a fact.
Yeah, in Montclair, our inclusionary zoning ordinance that's in place requires that those developers that are doing the projects you're talking about would do 20% affordability. In the past few years, the township has made some arrangements where they're getting 10% affordability and then some other give-backs and some exchanges that the majority of the council felt would be beneficial for the township. Yes.
I have a question about something you said earlier. You said that rent control wasn't the will of the majority of the people. How is that determined? Is that a voting thing?
Well, I'm going to just say that as soon as we were given the rent control documents from the Housing Commission, that they were circulated to a lot of people that are in a position to make decisions, and that there was not an overwhelming response like we need to get on that because this is something that we want to pursue right away. And it was very relaxed. And at that time, Mr. Scott and I spoke, and he decided that he could take the rent control document and the desire to pursue rent control, or just to explore, I should say, if there was an interest, under the wing of the NAACP. And that's when he partnered with Planet Civic, and so there's an online opportunity to do that. At our last community meeting here, we discussed briefly the rent control. I know he's been having other meetings like with the NAACP and other things, but basically just based on the fact that all of these meetings, events, and opportunities for input or people to say, yes, let's do it, have been out here for how many months now? We started that in about 2.5 or 3 months, and the response has been slow. And so I don't know if it's just a matter of, and Mr. Scott, went door to door. I always go door to door, and so we were trying to really gauge that. So it's very difficult to gauge, but that's why I said it's just lukewarm at best, and I'm not right at this point in time feeling that the majority of the people that are in positions that could make the greatest difference in that regard or have that on the fore as top and most important. Yes?
Is it anonymous if you want to report something as far as you thinking or wonder if it's violating fair housing?
You might want to repeat the question.
So she asked if if someone calls in to Citizen Action to report a fair housing complaint, if they can remain anonymous, and yes, they can, because if someone calls in to make a complaint and say this is happening to me, and it goes all the way to a HUD complaint, a name is not required to put on the form for the HUD complaint, so it can remain anonymous.
I think Mr. Scott or someone mentioned the importance of reaching out to your legislators, and I can't enforce that enough, because even in terms of nationally, when people are feeling that federal officials are actively undermining some of the great works of the Fair Housing Act, the amendments, and the intent of the Fair Housing Act, it's really incumbent upon us to continue to petition our legislators and let them know how we feel, and that it's just as important today as ever, if not more. And those things do make a difference. So reach out to, your legislators, reach out to your local elected officials, state and others, because it does make a difference. Anyone else wish to share anything or ask a question? Yes.
Well, I don't know whether it's actually a question. I basically came to hear more about HUD houses.
Yeah.
Since there's just so much to do about it, coming from the top all the way down. And you mentioned that a person could be evicted. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Yes, my Lord.
If they don't renew their list. Now, I live in East Orange, and I live in a beautiful senior development, very well kept, nice, clean, but the infrastructure, the units and, let's say, social service supports are not there. It's very easy for an elderly person to forget where their paperwork is and things like that. And it's almost as if nobody cares. I worked with senior citizens for a very long time in residence myself. And
level of the staff has gone down, people are not knowledgeable, and I'm just very concerned about it because at one point we were told they're going to go up on our rent 5%. And there was no explanation other than we need to pay benefits for our maintenance, and nobody wanted to question, not the president of the tenant association, who was just not up on things, you know. And a group of us had to get together and write a letter and sign a petition going to HUD and New Jersey Finance Department, all over the place. And finally, the management sent out a notice explaining exactly what they meant. Okay? They cannot go up on our base on our rent. They meant the market rent they were going up on. But there had to be an explanation, and things are being thrown out there at senior citizens who really, you know, they have no idea, no clue. It's signing lease, anything. This year we got a detailed list of how much every little thing is going to cost. That was not on there on the lease last year. So the things that are going on and being taken away, that, you know, the community is totally unaware of. The people who live in the housing units are totally unaware of as well. So I don't know what to do about it. I don't know if the tenant association is a part of the Fair Housing Act, but the people they have in charge are people who were basically kind of appointed by the management, the owners of the building. So there's no real separation of resident and management, you know. So it's to me, I see a lot of danger, you know.
I'm going to say a couple things that maybe you want to add. For the senior housing, you can reach out to the State of New Jersey Office of the Ombudsman. Okay, and what they do is they address issues of a number of types of things, but they specifically have a department that deals with senior housing violations. Okay, and they will send someone in to come in and test or review how the management is treating the seniors there. Sounds like a number of things are happening. All landlords are required by law to give you a notice that's in advance of any changes to your lease, especially when it's time for renewal. I'm not really sure if this is a HUD situation or...
Well, it's also a city, we have rent control.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. And in order for a landlord, any landlord, to go up on rent, they have to get permission from the city rent review board.
That's correct.
Okay. I knew that. No one else knew that. I mean, what I'm saying is that there's a lack of knowledge that's just bowling us over. The other thing is, if you go up on rent, the owner has to make a significant amount of improvements, not just to his well-kept property, grass is cut, everything is nice, I'm very proud of it, but there are units where we live that have to be updated. I asked for a walk-in bathtub myself because nobody uses those bathtubs. They take showers. The bathtubs are too high for seniors to climb up in. Some of them have arthritis so bad they can't, pull themselves up. And those things are just not being addressed. I know a walk-in bathtub is very expensive, but they have to figure out a way to, put doorbells in, make sure we have the proper lighting, some sort of cabinet around our sinks. I mean, it's, some of us are so happy to be there, until they would never complain.
you know, they would never complain. But when I said a walk-in bathtub, everybody stood up and cheered. So that they didn't know they knew. But that's all.
It sounds like she has multiple.
Yeah, I agree with what you told her about the husband's office, and then obviously, you know, if you go down to these stories, the municipal building, and go to the landlord tenant office and file a complaint if there is one. Otherwise, you know, you could always visit a local attorney to see that process could help.
They also have an office of senior citizen in the city of East Orange that will address that as well.
Yeah, so some of these items that you mentioned, you know, are for, so you can enjoy the dwelling and, yes, quality of life. So that, you know, I would encourage you to give me a call about, because we have clients all over the state that face these same issues, and we can advocate on your behalf. If there's something we can do, it'll definitely help you. So.
I mean, I want to say, I'm fortunate to live in a very well-kept place. We have a patio on the roof, okay? It's nice, but like I said, the infrastructure and what's going on with the seniors socially is, you know, it's not very good. It's not positive.
I'd like to recognize Dean James Harris, the first Vice President of the Montclair NAACP, along with so many other hats. I'd like to offer you an opportunity. Would you like to add anything in, you know, the discussion on fair housing here, or good of the order before we adjourn?
I would. First of all, I want to thank Councilwoman Baskerville for doing what she does so very well. Citizen Action Program, because I'm supposed to be there tonight, okay. But I thought you can't say no to Renee Baskerville, because you know if she calls, it's important. I also want to say that William Scott is one of the hardest working people when it comes to housing. My big question is, for those of us who've lived in Montclair, whatever happened to the tenants organization? That's what's missing in this discussion. We need folks to be organized as tenants so that there's an organized voice to go before legislators and policymakers. We have landlord housing.
Landlord tenant, yes. Landlord.
Well, guess what the majority of that group is made up of? Landlords. Now, I don't have a thing against landlords, except I don't expect them to vote to decrease their profit. It's not going to happen. So what is missing is a strong tenants organization in Montclair and in communities. Now, can anybody tell me what happened to it? Because there was a strong tenants organization in Montclair at one point. Mitch Schaefer,
I won't try to answer that.
Yes.
Some guesses, but if you want to start forming one, I'm with you.
Let's do it. Okay?
Anybody else want to be on the tenants organization, organizing advocacy organization?
And by the way, there is a strong state tenants organization. It's just part of the New Jersey Citizen Actions Executive Committee. But that's what's missing. You see, here's what I see in terms of civil rights. We worked really, really hard to get these laws passed. NAACP was out front with our Jewish colleagues. Thou shalt not discriminate based on race. That was us. Religion was the Jewish community, right? Nationality was somebody else. So we got these laws on the books. But now I hear Moretta Short, who's the president of the Essex County National Organization of Women, saying, we got people who are getting their rights violated even with the laws on the books. Well, how do you deal with people who break the law? You have to take them to court
and you have to be politically organized to make folks do the right thing. Because we're in a situation where people are intentionally violating laws, starting at the White House, starting with the state of New Jersey. The Abbott decision. We have one of the strongest fair share housing acts in the country. So how is it that people are still getting their rights violated? It's because organizing, particularly poor people, has become a very hard job. Let me say that again. Some people don't like for me to say it. Organizing poor people has become a very hard job because for people in public housing, they're afraid to speak up because if you move them out of public housing, they have no housing at all. So their rights are being violated because they're fearful if they raise their voices, they can be demonized. That would be illegal, wouldn't it? But it's happening. So my plea tonight is to say thank you to Councilwoman Baskerville, but let's get serious and let's get real and get the people organized, because if you, and William will tell you, most of the time when he goes before the city council, he's standing up as the chairman of the Housing Commission, as a member of the Housing Commission, NAACP, but there's no one standing in back of him. Politicians don't listen to individuals unless you can either help them or hurt them. Let me say that again. Politicians will not pay attention to you unless you can help them or hurt them. And if you're at home and not raising your voice, you're not organized, guess what? They just listen to James and go on about the business as usual. So I'm happy we're having this discussion, but I really believe that if Montclair is going to push back against the people who are getting up out of here, and a whole lot of, y'all know who's getting up out of here, right? Low-income citizens and senior citizens. But when I saw the education demographics, and they said that the population at the high school is now at 25% African American, that means a lot of black folks have left this town. And the reason why they're leaving the town is they can't afford the rent. And the senior citizens are saying, I'm not going to pay $15,000 or $20,000 for a school system that I don't have kids in. And I can go to Florida or some other state or even some other county and pay less. So my plea is, let's do what civil rights has always done. Let's get organized. Let's get vocal. And let's go and help the people who need us the most. Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.